Okay, so let's start. Hello, everybody. Here is Professor Adalberto speaking. It's 9 a.m. here in Brazil, so good morning. I'd like to officially open the second International Symposium in Transportation Engineering, which was organized by the two graduate programs in Transportation Engineering of the University of São Paulo, the one at the São Carlos School of Engineering and the one at the Polytechnic School. We'll have 16 keynote speakers over these 2 weeks, and they will talk about a wide variety of topics on transportation engineering. I'd like to thank all the professors and students who helped us organize this symposium. I'd like to thank Carlos too, who is organizing the transmission on YouTube. I also thank CAPES and AMPET for supporting our event. Professor Karst, thank you too for staying with us, for being the first speaker in our symposium. It's a great pleasure to see you here with us. Thank you, Nelson, for being the chair of this session. And may we all have a good symposium. Professor Flavio is the next to talk. The word's with you now, Flavio, please.
Hello, everyone. On behalf of the graduate program in Transportation Engineering at the Polytechnic School of the University of São Paulo, I would like to thank everyone for participating. Thanks the speakers for your availability, and thank all the organizers. I would also like to emphasize the importance of this event in consolidating relationship between the institutions. And I wish a fruitful event. Good luck for all. Thank you.
Okay, Nelson, the word is with you now.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Karst. He's a colleague from the University of Twente in the Netherlands. He's a full professor in transport planning there. He's a well-known researcher and professor in the Netherlands and abroad. He got his transportation engineering degree in 1992 at Breda University of Applied Science in the Netherlands. Later on, he got his master's in environmental science at Utrecht University, also in the Netherlands, the same place where he got his PhD with the topic accessibility, land use, and transport. So he got his PhD in 2006. He's a full professor since 2013 at the University of Twente, but he has been teaching there for longer than that. It's my great pleasure to introduce him. He's not only a very well-known researcher, but a good partner. We signed a double degree agreement for doctoral students last year. He will talk a little bit about this right now before he starts the speech itself. And it's my really great pleasure to receive you here, Karst. Please, without further ado, let's hear from him.
Yeah, thanks very much for this kind introduction, Nelson. And yeah, thanks very much, of course, also for inviting me. So let me just start up a screen. So hopefully you can see my slides now. Okay, so I figured I would talk a little bit about smart accessibility rather than smart mobility, also given the title of this whole symposium and my background research, which has been mainly focusing on accessibility, but I will explain this in a minute. Yeah, so this is the content of this presentation. Start first with the introduction, a little bit of background of where I'm from, University of Twente, then a small introduction on different perspectives on accessibility. I will explain 2 examples of 2 applications that we did. Actually, this was a joint project also with the University of São Paulo. Then I will move on to a discussion on what actually does it mean, smart accessibility. And then I'll end up with a small research agenda on this topic. Okay, so for those who do not know, University of Twente is based in the eastern part of the Netherlands, near the German border. And our university is, as a motto, is high-tech human touch. So it's very much combining technical and social sciences, trying to link different disciplines, really a cross-disciplinary way of working. This is also very much in my own research that I like to conduct interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary research. Our university is one of the most, or the most entrepreneurial university in the Netherlands, so we work a lot with industry and all kinds of partners in doing research. And we also have very much an international orientation. We are the only campus, really campus-based university, so we have all kinds of facilities, not only teaching, but also housing, theater, sports, everything is on one single campus. And we also use the campus as a living lab as well, also for research. And a lot of the international students actually like the campus for this purpose as well. So I'm in the Department of Civil Engineering, Faculty of Engineering. In our department, we have over 600 master and bachelor students and about 50 PhD students. In the department, we have 4 groups, and I'm in the transport group. If you're interested, you can have a look at the website. What Professor Nelson already stated, that last year we signed a joint PhD degree between University of São Paulo, so both the São Carlos Engineering School and also the Polytechnic School. And here you see on this photo, you see the 3 deans actually in the signing process. And actually we are now also actively recruiting new PhD students to actually join our joint PhD degree. And it's a joint PhD degree, which means that there is one single diploma where both the logo of University of São Paulo, but also University of Twente will be there, and we follow the procedures for both doctorate schools. A little bit of my background. Well, Nelson already explained a little bit. Nowadays, we have very nice website where you can, let's say, see the background of each individual staff member. Besides being a full professor in transportation planning, I'm also editor-in-chief of the European Transport Research Review, which is an open access journal hosted by Springer. I'm also chairing a European network of transportation researchers, which until I would say March with the COVID was organizing a lot of workshops and meetings, mainly in Europe, but also across the world. Actually, we also had a workshop in São Paulo actually a couple of years ago. Nice thing about this website is actually it also gives you a fingerprint, and when all the papers and research that you have been done, and you can see that my main fingerprint is actually on accessibility research, but also cycling, public transport, and also smartphone-based research that I've been doing. If you're interested, just you can have a look at the webpage as well. Let me move on to my view on smart accessibility and actually accessibility. So there's a lot of work going on related to smart mobility, and of course, smart mobility is let's say defined in various ways, but you could say it's a new area which encompasses the variety of ICT-related mobility innovations. So this varies from apps, app-based services, to rent a taxi like 99 or Uber, or shared bikes like the ones from TMBC. So these are app-based services where through an app you can book and reserve a transport mode. It also is linked to intelligent infrastructure and vehicles. So for example, in the Netherlands, there's a lot of work at the moment going on smart traffic lights, where also traffic light would detect a vehicle, which could be a truck, which could be a car, but also a cyclist. And then depending on, let's say, the priority scheme, it might give a priority to the cyclist, for example, or give a priority when it's raining, So you see actually the user, the vehicle interacting with the infrastructure. There's a growing amount of work which is done on public transport innovations, mobility as a service, where you can book, plan, and pay for different forms of transport through a single app. So it could be a taxi, it could be a bus, it could be a bike, a shared car, and there are actually quite a few pilots, projects running at the moment. Most of them are in Europe, and quite a few have actually also started in the Netherlands as well. And some say the future of smart mobility might be a RoboCab, where you have a full automated vehicle which you can order and comes by your house, and there's no driver, and it will pick you up and bring you to your final destination. Although I think this will be quite a few years from now where it will actually be common, but this is what, this is a trend which certainly fits within, let's say, the concept of smart mobility. In this talk, I will not so much focus on automated transport. I will leave this for others, but I will be talking about other forms of smart mobility. But having said that, I think we should not so much focus on smart mobility, but we should focus on smart accessibility. Now, what is the difference? There is actually a fundamental difference between mobility and accessibility. When you talk about mobility, you talk about actual spatial interactions, the trips that people actually are making. And then people talk about travel times or travel costs, or having access to specific locations that people would visit, or problems accessing maybe a bus or public transport. But this is related to mobility and travel of people. Whereas accessibility is not so much focusing on actual trips made, but on the potential of interaction. And this is fundamentally a different concept. And the main reason why I think accessibility is interesting and important is that mobility is not always, of course, a good reflection of what people actually can do or what people would want to do. Right? There are a lot of barriers in terms of traveling. You might want to make a trip by bus, by public transport, by bike, but if the quality of the infrastructure is insufficient or you feel unsafe, you're not making the trip, and you might be staying at home rather than being mobile. So if you focus on mobility, you will not see this dimension of immobility in your analysis, whereas if you focus on accessibility, you focus on what is actually the potential of interaction that people would possibly be able to do rather than what they actually can or will do. So, and this brings me actually to a concept of smart mobility and the role of transport actually in society in general. And in my view, the role of transport in society is actually to provide individuals the opportunity to participate in activities in different locations. So transport is not a goal by itself. It's a means to enable people to participate in work, go to a cafe, or all kinds of activities, visit your family, to participate in all kinds of activities to make your life actually, livable and enjoyable. And in my view, we should also look at smart mobility in this view. So smart mobility is not also a goal in itself. We should not have app-driven mobility or automated vehicles simply because it's nice to have the technology. No, it should be there to help improve accessibility of households, families, and firms, rather than just promoting mobility itself. And most research actually related to smart mobility actually focusing on the development of the technologies of smart mobility and focusing on the impacts of smart mobility rather than looking at what does it actually contribute to society. So why does smart mobility actually help improving accessibility? So why does it help to improve the transport system? So I think we need more research on measuring smart accessibility as well. And this is also why I thought it would be a good topic to discuss with you today. Now, when I talk about accessibility, I distinguish 4 different components which are determining accessibility. And this is coming from a paper which I published already quite a few years ago in Transport Geography. And this is by far the best cited paper in accessibility studies of the past, I could say 15 years. At the moment, it's still quite heavily cited, over 1,000 citations. And part of this is actually, I think, this framework to explain accessibility. So, of course, the transport system itself, how much time, cost, effort it takes you to get from A to B is, of course, very much influencing how accessible locations will be for households or firms. But also there's a very much important, and this is the land use component. So you don't want to travel because you like to travel. You want to go to a location and enjoy a certain activity. So the spatial distribution of activities is also very much important to determine accessibility. So you can perhaps travel very far and fast in remote areas, but if densities are very low, it takes you a long time to travel to get to a job, your level of access will actually be much lower than just if you look at the speed of traveling. Accessibility, of course, is also very much a temporal phenomena because the availability of opportunities varies over time, across the day, opening hours of shops and so on, but also of course travel times also vary with peak hours and off-peak hours, for example. There's also a sort of household interaction here. So within a household, people also allocate a certain amount of time for traveling, and there's also interaction of who might take the vehicle, for example, there. So there's very much also a time budget issue here as well. And also very importantly, accessibility is also very much depending on individual needs, capabilities, opportunities. For example, do you have a driver license? Do you have access to a car? Is there any restriction that you have in terms of traveling? Any, let's say, physical impairment? Elderly people, for example. Do you have the income, the budget to pay for your bus ticket to access public transport? So the fourth component, the individual component, is also very much an explanatory factor for accessibility. So when I talk about accessibility, you need to find a way in research to balance those four components in determining accessibility of specific locations. Now, accessibility is very much defined in very different ways and measured in many different ways, and it also mainly comes down to the economic, the discipline of origin that you're from. So if you are in transport engineering, transport planning, most studies would focus on just the transport component in terms of time, cost, how fast can you go from A to B, did I encounter congestion, and how do we solve this problem on the network. So this is mainly focusing what I call the infrastructure-based perspective. So you view mainly the performance of the transport network. Geographers and urban planners are focusing more on the location-based perspective, where they would not look at networks, but looking at locations. So how well are certain locations accessible, or how far can you go from specific locations? Time geographers, which is a specific, you could say, field of research, would focus on more individual-based or person-based perspective, where each individual might have a very different time-space pattern. And then economic geographers, economists, spatial economics, focus mainly on what are the economic benefits that companies or people actually derive from having access to spatially distributed opportunities. So this is focusing on the utility-based perspective. So depending on the discipline of, you could say, training, you often see that people are focusing on a specific component or a couple of these components. Now, today I will focus mainly on the location-based perspective, so a little bit more on the geographical perspective of accessibility. why is it important? Again, this is going back to why do I think it's important to focus on accessibility rather than mobility. So accessibility is, in my view, a multifaceted framework. So you need to take into different disciplines. So what people can do, how they can travel, or what they want to do is often not necessarily what they actually can do. Right, so there might be a mismatch in mode preferences. People who would like to ride a bike, maybe in São Paulo, feel it's unsafe, or might be not having access to the proper infrastructure. There might be issues of transport poverty. You might be willing to travel by public transport, but if you don't have the budget to pay for it, you cannot actually use it to go to work. There are, of course, disadvantaged groups or more vulnerable groups, younger people, elderly people. So, yeah, what people actually can do, how mobile they are, is sometimes very different, different from accessibility. This also provides the links to equity and social justice analysis, where you look at how opportunities are very much differing from different population segments, which could be young, elderly, or it could be people who have less digital skills. Not everybody is able to use a smartphone or even have a smartphone, and even if they have it, use it to book a taxi or get a shared bike. So the concept of accessibility actually is quite useful to study equity and social justice issues. And this is an example I will give in a minute of a study looking at this. Also, accessibility is also very much related to potentially travel satisfaction and well-being. So how many opportunities you have, you could assume that you're more happy or more satisfied with your travel options if you have multiple travel options that you could take. You might be, let's say, better off, a better life quality, more well-being in general if you have access to multiple opportunities. So the concept of accessibility might also stretch out to travel satisfaction and well-being. And this will be a second example of a study that I'll be showing you in a minute. And of course, accessibility is not only linked to social issues, but also, of course, very much to economic developments, economic theories, regional economic development, land value, housing prices, and so on actually depend on the level of accessibility. So when access is high, typically also land value and housing prices are high as well. Well, for this talk, I will not dwell on the economic dimension. Because I would like to focus on the two applications that we did recently in a project which was called ISTE, Accessibility, Social Justice and Transport Emissions Impact of Transit-Oriented Development Strategies. So this was a project which we did together with University of São Paulo, and also University of Surrey was involved, and we were looking at both. We were looking at three metropolitan regions, three case studies. So São Paulo was one, London, and also the Netherlands was a case study. In this case, we were looking at specifically the most urbanized part of the Netherlands, which is the Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Utrecht area, which is called the Randstad, which in terms of the working population size is sort of similar to Greater London and a little bit smaller than São Paulo municipality. In terms of area, it's bigger, and in terms of population, it's density. It's although we think that the Netherlands is already very much densely populated, London and São Paulo are much stronger, more higher in terms of population density. So these areas are quite different, and a major challenge was also to do an accessibility analysis. We did also look at housing preferences, and we also looked at air pollution, exposure to air pollution. But in this talk, I will only talk about the accessibility part. But of course, a major challenge was to collect data for each of those three very different case study areas. Now, if you're interested in some of the papers and outcomes that we produced so far, so this is a small list of papers. You can have a look at it. I will talk as an example on two of these papers. So one is on the potential impact of the integration of cycling with public transport. We studied this for the Netherlands and also for Sao Paulo. And a second paper was actually on the link between accessibility, job accessibility, and satisfaction of traveling. And this is the second example I would want to give you. And this is a paper which is already submitted and is still in review. We hope to get this published in a month from now. We also studied exposure to air pollution during the commute with different modes of transport, by car, by public transport, cycling. We did a measurement campaign in all the three case study areas. I will not talk about it today, but if you're interested, you can have a look at these papers if you're interested in that. And we also looked at the housing market and differences in opportunities in the housing market as well for the three different case studies. But again, I will, for this lecture, only focus on the accessibility papers. Okay, so what we try to do is looking at the four different components of accessibility, and now we are focusing only on job accessibility. So we use data, land use data, high resolution land use data, which for the Netherlands was postcode 5, but we also use similar data for London and for Sao Paulo. So getting high resolution spatial data or where people actually live and where they work. We tried to use as much detailed transport data. So we used travel times by car. We used TomTom data for all three of the cities, the case study areas. We used a public transport model, which I will explain in a minute, to look at what would be the impact of integration of cycling with public transport. The temporal dynamics was actually already in the data, so we used general transport fee data for public transport. We used TomTom data for the car, so we actually have a 24-hour temporal variation in the travel times. And in each of the three cities, we did a very large survey with sample size between 1,000 in London to 1,600 in the Netherlands. For Sao Paulo, it was roughly 1,200. And in Sao Paulo, actually, we went door to door in different areas in Sao Paulo. So we stratified by income and also by Human Development Index, where we were looking at both the high and the medium and also the low income areas. Okay, so as an example, the first example on what is the benefit of looking at smart mobility from a accessibility viewpoint is this paper which we did on the impact of bicycle train integration. We did one analysis for the Netherlands, which was published in a book chapter, and we did one paper which was published in Transportation Research last year. The two photos, you can more or less see already the main difference between the integration of cycling with public transport in the Netherlands. So this is a picture from the largest bicycle park in the Netherlands. This is the bicycle park of Utrecht near a railway station. It even has routing to where are the vacant spots, where can you park your bike, and this bike park has over 12,000 spots to park your bike, and it has 3 stories. And if you go out the park, you're immediately on the train station and you're on the platform to take your train. Whereas this is an example of in Sao Paulo, where you have a train station which is actually literally along a bicycle path, which is along the Pinheiros River. I also did a cycling trip there 2 years ago. And to my surprise, even if you have a very comfortable bicycle path, and you're literally passing the railway station, there's no way of actually accessing the railway station because there's a fence and you cannot access the train station from this direction because the entry is on the other side. And this will take you a detour of maybe even 5, 6, 7 kilometers to actually access the railway station. So these are 2 extremes in terms of integration of cycling facilities with public transport. So what we did in this paper is we developed a public transport model based on GTFS data. So this is data which is openly available through a standard format, which was developed by Google, but nowadays it's called General Transit Feed Specification. We developed a GES-based model where we have the traditional, let's say, combination of walking as an access mode, as a feeder mode, use public transport, and then you walk again to your final destination. So this is what a typical travel planner would generate. We added a bike for trips shorter than 30 minutes and trips which are longer than 200 meters as an access mode to feed public transport, and then again walking to your final destination, which is also what is typically done in the Netherlands as well. In the Netherlands, about 50% of the train trips are actually by bike to the train station as a feeder mode. So this is option B. Instead of walking as an access mode, you can use the bike, or maybe the bike is faster from origin to destination, then the choice will be to take the bike for the complete trip, as long as the trip is shorter than 30 minutes and longer than 200 meters. So this was the public transport model, and we estimated different accessibility indicators, but I will only focus on one today, which is the potential accessibility indicator, where accessibility is a function of the number of jobs you can reach to any other location multiplied by the impedance with a distance decay function to reach those locations. So it's a combination of the volume of opportunities with the impedance to get there. For the cycling network, we actually based the cycling speeds on Dutch data because we had a very comprehensive data set on using smartphones to collect cycling speeds for different types of bicycle paths, but we controlled, of course, for the difference in cycling circumstances between the Netherlands and Sao Paulo. So we corrected for network density, hilliness, availability of the cycling infrastructure, and also waiting times of intersection, depending on the functional road class and the congestion level based on the TomTom data. So we were using the cycling network to partly to define the cycling speed in the public transport model. Now, what we found is, and these two pictures show the outcome of this work. So this is for 7 o'clock in the morning. There's the combination of walk and ride. So this is the typical, you could say, advice you would get from a travel planner. And this is when you add the bicycle as a feeder mode. So you see mainly the center of Sao Paulo is expanding quite heavily. So the bluer it gets, the higher the job accessibility is. So the more jobs you can access. And you can see it certainly increases the city center, also stretching a bit towards the east and towards the south. And you, on average, if you add the bike to the model, it would increase job accessibility by about 40%. At the same time, those benefits of having this integration of the bike and public transport is certainly not equally distributed. So most of the benefits are actually in the already high accessibility areas, which is the center, and the east and also the south. So the lower income areas, also going into the favelas. Actually, there are some improvements, but they're not so high as in the city center. And of course, this is because there's the quality of public transport is much lower. So it's nice if you can cycle to a bus stop, but if the bus does not go, or maybe very infrequently, or the travel time from a favela to the city center will be 2-3 hours, then the bike does actually not add too much. So what we found is that actually adding the bike as a feeder mode is actually increasing inequalities in job accessibility rather than decreasing it. So for the Dutch case, we did a similar study, and we quite clearly found that it would reduce inequalities. Also, lower income workers would benefit from having a good connection between a bike and public transport. In the São Paulo case, this is not the case, because the lower incomes, as you all know, are in the periphery, and they are less benefiting than others. So this was maybe a bit of a surprising result. And at the same time, where you would compare the walk and ride and the bike and ride with job accessibility by car, it's quite clear that the bike is actually helping to increase job accessibility, but you can still not compete with the car. So this is job accessibility by car. So you can clearly see for a 24 hours period of the day. So this is midnight to midnight. Here are the morning peaks, afternoon peaks. So of course, in the peak hours, there's congestion, so longer trip times. So there's a drop in the number of jobs you can access by car, according to the TomTom data that we have used. But you can still see, despite having the bike, there's still a factor 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on the location, difference between job accessibility by car and by public transport. So the car is always winning. So you could say what this study shows, as an example of an accessibility study, that its accessibility analysis is quite helpful to identify the potential and also the spatial inequalities of smarter, in this case, integrated transport systems. The outcome of this paper was that actually, if you want to improve job accessibility and reduce inequalities, you need investments in public transport rather than investing in bike and train integrations. Stretching the public transport connections to the lower income areas, especially to the east, would certainly be useful to increase job accessibility for low income workers. Okay, then the second example that I would briefly like to share is a paper where we were looking at how does accessibility relate to satisfaction with travel. The inspiration for this project was this paper by Redmond and Mokhtarian, which was published in 2001. What they found is there's a huge difference between the actual commuting time, what people are spending to get to work, versus what they actually would want as an ideal commuting time. So the ideal commuting time is actually higher for short distance trips, and it's the actual commuting time is much higher for longer ones. So up to, let's say, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, it's would say the optimal level of commuting times. People who have a shorter commute, shorter than 20 minutes, actually would be willing to spend a little bit longer time. And if you're traveling more than 30 minutes, this is longer than what you actually would want to spend. So there is a big difference between your desirable, your ideal commuting time and the actual commuting time. And we were interested in analyzing this as well for São Paulo, for London and the Netherlands, and also seeing how this would affect accessibility. So we know travel satisfaction is important, and we know that the longer the commuting time, the less satisfied people are. We also know from various research that individuals who are walking or cycling, so active mode of transport, are typically also more satisfied and more happy with their commute. People are less satisfied with public transport, typically, although more satisfied with train and metro than with bus. Few studies have tried to include travel satisfaction into accessibility studies. There is one recent one who developed satisfaction-based distance decay function. But there have been others who were more from a theoretical point of view argued that, if you have access to spatial distributed opportunities, you have good access, high levels of access, you might have better belonging, feelings, competence, and you feel more free to travel the things that you want to travel to. So in the survey that I already explained that we did in the 3 different cities, we also asked about commuting times. So we asked roughly on a typical day, how long is your current commute? We asked about what is your ideal commute? How long would you like to commute to? How long would you like your commute to be? And what would be your maximum willing commuting length? So when you look at the differences between the Netherlands, London, and São Paulo in terms of actual commuting times, you see that it's quite clear travel times in São Paulo are much longer than they are in London, but especially much longer than they are in the Netherlands. So Netherlands is the blue bar, London is the orange one, and São Paulo is the gray one. But still, you see there is sort of an increasing, let's say, travel time with the distance. But when you look at ideal, it's very different. So the distribution of trips is much different when you look at actual commuting time versus the ideal ones. So the ideal ones are much closer, and also there are much less differences between what the residents of São Paulo think and what the residents of the Netherlands think. So on average, 20 minutes is sort of ideal for Dutch commuters, but also Londoners and also people in São Paulo. So there is a difference in terms of ideal, but these are minutes. So for the Dutch, they think 70 minutes is okay. For London, 21. For São Paulo, 23. It's a couple of minutes, which is different. When you look at the actual commuting times, the difference is much larger. And also for the maximum accepted commuting time, it's also much larger. So it seems that for both the paper from Redmond and Mokhtarian in the US, it was about 20 minutes. It seems that people across the globe accept 20 minutes as their ideal commuting time, but they cannot actually most of us cannot get to our ideal commuting time. This also links to satisfaction. So this is also what we asked: how satisfied are you with your current commuting duration? The Dutch are the most satisfied, so over 60% is actually satisfied with their actual duration of their commute. The least satisfied are the residents of São Paulo, and then they are the least satisfied actually with using public transport. So the most satisfied are people who are cycling or walking to work. For the Dutch, it's almost 80% of the people who are mainly cycling to work are quite happy with the commuting time. Decreases a bit, of course, London, São Paulo. The private transport is significantly lower, and then especially public transport is also significantly lower in terms of satisfaction with commuting time. So across the board, people are less satisfied with public transport than they are with active modes, and people in São Paulo are much less satisfied than the residents in London and in the Netherlands. Now, we estimated based on this stated commuting times. We estimated distance decay curves for the Greater London area, the metropolitan region of São Paulo, and the Netherlands, to estimate at the end a job accessibility by public transport. So this is based on the actual commuting times. This is what you would get if you would put in the 20 minutes. This is what you would put in if you would add the maximum accepted commuting time. So what you clearly see is that if people would follow their ideal, their preferences, this would result in a strong decrease in their level of job opportunity. So this is also why people cannot meet this ideal, because you have to find a job and get to work. So you can actually not meet your ideal, and this is the same in Sao Paulo, where your ideal commute would lead you to a very strong reduction of job accessibility. And if you accept very long commutes, then your level of job accessibility is actually increasing. So this is actually, I think, very much explaining the difference between looking at mobility versus looking at accessibility. And the same for London as well. Actual travel times, the current travel times versus the ideal versus the maximum willingness. So if you're willing to accept a long travel time, your access levels is strongly increasing. And if you look at ideal, so the 20-minute travel times, this is reducing your level of job accessibility by, in this case, in London, 85%. For Sao Paulo, this is over 70%, or for the Netherlands, also slightly over 70%. So job accessibility is very heavily affected by commuting preferences, especially the ideal commuting time would strongly reduce job accessibility. The gap between what people do, their actual commuting time, versus what they ideally would want to do, is the smallest for cyclists, for walking, so the active commuters, and they're also more satisfied. So the closer you are to your ideal, the more satisfied you are with your commute, and typically you would expect you're also more satisfied with life in general. What we try to do is run some logistic models, logistic regression models, to actually show correlation, to explain the link between satisfaction with the commute and accessibility. Actually, what we found that job accessibility has a fairly weak association with travel satisfaction, and commuting time is the strongest predictor. And actual commuting time is negatively correlated with satisfaction. So the longer your commute, the less satisfied you are. So in general, yeah, the current land use transport systems, especially the one in Sao Paulo, but also the one in London, and to a lesser extent the one in the Netherlands, does not enable most people to meet their commuting preferences and their needs. So these are two examples of accessibility projects to show what does having a perspective on accessibility add, rather than the perspective on looking at mobility. Now, when you would look at the impacts of smart mobility, or you could say digitalization in general, has an effect on all four components of accessibility. Right, so the transport, the land use, the temporal, but also the individual component. So any app-based mobility service, albeit a ride-sharing app, or a bike-sharing app, or a car-sharing app, would affect the transport components. Intelligent infrastructure, vehicle technologies also affect the transport components. Having a mobile phone, having internet at home, actually also affects the other components. And there are all kinds of interactions between the components as well. This figure is a slightly adapted version of a paper we did a couple of years ago on the role of ICT on accessibility. And what I added was the smart mobility, you could say, dimension to it, because the paper was mainly focusing on ICT in general. So the point is, digitalization, ICT, affects all four components, which makes it quite complex to analyze. And the transport component might affect where people live, so the land use component, when they travel, the temporal component, and also who actually has access to those services. If you're older, if you're younger, do you have actually the capabilities and the skills to use it or not? So it has an effect on all four components. So let me briefly walk you through. So you could say smart accessibility. So this would be, let's say, any ICT-driven innovation in mobility, or let's say smart mobility, potentially affects various components of the transport component. So time, cost, and effort. This is very clear what we have seen, of course, with also the COVID restrictions, not being able to go to the office. Also today we're doing this lecture online. We're doing it from home. It has a very clear effect on the transport system, of course, in the number of trips, congestion, mode choice, and so on. So having internet, having the opportunity to use applications like Zoom or Teams actually allows you to still to work without traveling. So this is very much affecting also the transport system itself. I think what we do not yet really have a good grasp on is how do app-based mobility services really affect travel time, cost, and also the comfort of traveling, satisfaction with travel. I do not know any studies who looked at, for example, the effect of Uber or any app-based mobility services on satisfaction with traveling or commuting. The impacts of integration of physical and digital mobility is a question. Impacts on congestion, trip generation. So I think there are actually quite a few questions which you could address just looking at the effect of smart accessibility on the transport component, similar to the land use component. So how does it actually influence the spatial distribution of activities? So does teleworking affect locations of work, locations of living? Can we through teleworking, can we, let's say, commute at longer distances? Can we work at longer distance from home? What about activity fragmentation? What about the apps? Of course, they present you location-based services. What about, does it change actually the point that we visit, the friends that we visit, the shops that we visit? A lot of the research on smart mobility, ICT, is actually more theoretical when you look at the land use component, and little empirical research has been done. On the temporal component, there are also impacts. So of course, there's having internet, having a smartphone allows you to do all kinds of activities at the same time, right? So you can be in a train and update your social network through an app. You can work, you can be productive. There have been some studies already looking at what about value of time? Are we not overestimating value of time savings if you can also be productive? This was a recent study by the International Transport Forum, ITF, stating that, simply by having productive time in public transport, you are actually not always assuming to be only productive at work, at your destination, but you can also be productive while traveling. So this would reduce your value of travel time savings to 20-25%, some studies have showed. If you go into the automated era, automated taxis, potentially you can use a much larger set of the population can actually use their travel time more productively. But there are many, many uncertainties there. If you look at the individual component, of course, what we already know from, for example, bike sharing schemes, that not everybody is using those schemes. So typically young, white, high educated population segments are using shared bikes. So there are equity issues. Not everybody has a smartphone, not everybody has digital skills to book or plan a trip with a 99 taxi or with Uber or take a bike. We also have seen that the COVID restrictions has had very different results for different population segments. So not all of us, like academics, can work from home. If you are a blue collar worker, you have to go to work. You might be, let's say, going to public transport. So they're very much, let's say, depending on your personal circumstances, depending on the population segment you're in, you're affected more or less. What don't we know? Well, I think in terms of smart mobility, how does smart mobility or app-based mobility change people's wants, people's needs, people's abilities? What about self-selection, digital skills? Does app-based mobility increase inequalities related to transport poverty, disadvantaged groups? There are many questions that I think, yeah, could be topics for future research. And then I was only talking about the effect of smart mobility digitalization on the individual components, all 4 of them, the direct ones, but there are also interactions. What will be the interactions between improved levels of service for transport on housing preferences, for example, or on the temporal component? There's very little attention for these types of indirect effects. So there are quite a few gaps in our knowledge, which then leads me towards a research agenda. So this is not a completely developed research agenda, but this is mainly showing some directions for future research. So I think if you want to get a better grip on what actually is smart accessibility, so how smart mobility modes, app-driven mobility services affect accessibility, we would need to develop more longitudinal activity-based surveys, maybe based on smartphone data. In the Netherlands, there's been an initiative to start a smartphone based panel survey, which started last year using data from travel surveys from the smartphone, which is a very nice way of tracking travel patterns over time for different households. But this is only one example that I'm aware of. Developing accessibility measures, looking at satisfaction with travel, not only looking at travel time, costs, but also the wider set of impedances. How to include satisfaction with travel in accessibility analysis would, I think, be very interesting to expand on. What about modeling accessibility using shared mobility services? This could be done, for example, through stated choice experiments, where I think the first step would be first looking at how would adding shared bikes, shared cars, or even robo-taxis affect your level of service, your satisfaction with travel. So this would be the first step. The second step would be then looking at how would this add to the physical layer of accessibility. And the third step would be perhaps looking at the differences in the different population segments. So are people who are less skilled, are they benefiting as much as people who are digitally very skilled, or young, or elderly, or other population segments? Research on location-based services. Are we actually changing the destinations that we visit if we have app-based services? Are we going to different locations simply because they're better accessible? I think we need to be focusing on more user-centric design of smart mobility services, taking into account different needs and abilities of user groups. We can think of linking smart mobility accessibility to more social theories like the capability theory, or even the motility theory that I will not dwell on, but this is mainly thinking about, does smart mobility increase our freedom to travel, the capacity to be mobile, for example? So there are all kinds of new theories which are being used at the moment, but they're all focusing on mainly on mobility rather than accessibility. But given the time, I will not dwell on that so much. You'll find if you are thinking about this topic, it's very easy to state what are the gaps in our knowledge, but finding the answers is much more challenging. I think there's room here for several PhD projects on this topic. So I think it's a very challenging topic to move from smart mobility to smart accessibility type of research. And I would say, yeah, if you're interested, we're certainly eager to find PhD students who will be willing to join the joint PhD degree. And if you're interested, just let me know. Oh, I can actually give you the last slide, which is the contact information. So you can either call me or Professor Nelson, or at Poly, Professor Mariana Gianotti, if you want to know more about the joint PhD degree. Thanks a lot. I will now unshare, stop presenting, and see if you have some questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation, Karst. It was very nice. I liked it very much. We plan to have this session with a maximum of 1 hour, 1 hour and 10 minutes or so. So we have time for at least 2 or 3 questions. And of course, if people want to make more questions, we can save them for you later, and then you have time to think about them. But we have one question here right now. Let me get it to you. It's I had a problem with my Skype connection, so I will have to use this chat. So you can read it yourself, but I will read it to you. Good morning, Samuel Marcus. He's a PhD student here in our program. Good morning. Regarding one of the cited studies in the second example, I think he is referring to the papers that you described. What could be the reason why people are more satisfied with traveling by train than by metro?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think this also has to do with the length of the trip. So most train trips are longer than metros, which are typically urban, and this is more a lot of stops on the same trip. In a train, you have less stops and it's more comfortable typically, so you have more opportunity to be productive on the trip. Sort of intercity trains are typically also less crowded, so crowding is an issue by many metros, especially in the peak hours, and this is certainly lowering the level of satisfaction for metro compared to train. But I think it's mainly they are used for different types of trips. So metro more sort of interurban, and a train more interurban, so longer trips, and this makes it possible for you to be more productive, I would say. So I think this is a few reasons why I think travel satisfaction are higher for train than they are by metro. But I should say there are only 1 or 2 studies who are actually making this distinction. So I don't think this has been studied, for example, in the context of Sao Paulo. So it might be different for Sao Paulo. But this will be, I think, also a very nice topic to explore. That was my answer, Nelson.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you. We have another question here. Gabriel Macedo Duarte, he's also a student here. What will be, in your opinion, the permanent impacts of COVID-19 pandemics on the transportation system? That's a tough question. Which can be the impact on the quality of transportation from the user's standpoint? That's a difficult question.
Yeah, this is a very good question, of course, but this is, I would say, not so easy to answer. But I should say, I think the studies that I have seen, also the studies which have been done on a Dutch context, of course, in a Dutch context, of course, many people are cycling, and we actually see that the bike is becoming much more popular because of the COVID, because people try to avoid being in public transport because there's a higher risk of being infected. So we do see a shift for people who were traveling by public transport, and now they switch either to the car or to bike. And we have seen in the Netherlands, but also in many other European cities, a huge increase in bike sales. And people are switching to the bike. And also we have seen an increase in second-hand car sales as well. So private transport is becoming much more popular than public transport. And I think this is a risk that this will be a permanent effect. I know that public transport operators actually are worried heavily about this, that there might be permanent switches from public transport away to car and the bike. I'm not sure in a year or in 2 years from now it might change. But it also, of course, depends on the economic situation of the operators itself, because if you're losing 90% of the revenues, as an operator, you might also not survive. And if there's a lack of subsidies, I think you might not be able to generate the same level of service after the crisis than you were before the crisis. So I think there are multiple issues here. But I think this is a topic that many conferences will be looking at the moment, looking at the COVID impact on transport.
Okay, excellent. I agree with you. We have a third question here. Vanessa, she's also a PhD student here. Good morning. Thanks for sharing the application examples, Professor Geurs. In example 2, I would like to know how the differences in travel satisfaction between different social groups were addressed.
Yeah, again, that's a good question. Yeah, so we did try to look at how travel satisfaction actually differs between different population segments, and if this was affecting overall travel satisfaction levels, and also if in the presentation I only showed the main difference, which was actually more in mode use rather than the let's say the population segment. The issue with the sample size that we had is that not all respondents actually gave answer to what is your actual, what is your ideal, or what is your maximum commuting time. So the sample sizes were down to I think 600, 700, 800 in a different case study. So we're also not able to make a very detailed disaggregation of the travel satisfaction. But actually what we found is that the strongest predictor was actually the commuting duration and the mode use rather than the socioeconomic characteristics. So apparently, especially for the ideal commuting length, it appears that it doesn't really matter if you are low income or if you're very high income. People just like to spend 20 minutes for a commuting trip. And it does make sense because you want to be away from home. And you also do not want to waste too much travel time. So of course there are some variations, but yeah, it seems that yeah, the strongest variation was actually in the mode of transport. And if you then control for the mode, did not seem to be very much impacts on different population segments. Of course, we do know that of course modes are used by different segments. But beyond that, we did not see a very strong difference.
Okay, thank you. I have another question. Matheus Henrique is asking if accessibility is a potential measure, how can phone data, actual trip data, be used to improve accessibility measures?
Yeah, it's this seemed to be counterintuitive, right? That you need trip data to estimate a potential accessibility measure. In all potential accessibility measures, of course, you use the distance decay curve or an impedance function, where you want to account for the fact that people prefer short distance trips over long distance trips. And then you do need some form of a trip data, which could be a travel survey, but it could also be mobile phone data to estimate. Of course, mobile phone data or phone data is interesting because it takes you less effort to allow, let's say, a researcher through an app to track you, rather than you fill in a very long travel survey. The good thing about mobile phone data or smartphone data, we have used it in several projects, is that it allows you to track travel patterns not for one day. So normally when you do a travel survey, you would ask about how was your trip today, or what was your last trip that you made. And with mobile phone data or smartphone data, you can actually track people for multiple weeks, and it gives you much more detail in terms of the variation in travel patterns over time. Because let's say a Monday might be different from a Wednesday, and 1 week might be different from another. So even when you look at, let's say, accessibility, there's much more variation in a week or even across a month that you could control for using smartphone data. And also what we found is that this is also a way to collect data in a more longitudinal way. So for perhaps multiple waves, multiple years, for the same to track people's preferences and travel patterns over time. So we also change. I mean, our travel patterns and our travel preferences also change over the time. So smartphone based surveys where you use a smartphone to track, of course, with user consent, the travel patterns of people is quite a a good way to not have a high burden for the respondent, and at the same time allowing you to follow groups of people over time. So it creates specifically, I think, a good view of the dynamics in accessibility. So this is, I think, why phone data are interesting.
Okay. Let me see. I think that was the last question that was here. I have a question myself. I think it's going to be the last one because of the time. And when we look at the data that you presented in your in the papers, in the two papers, I was wondering what was the situation in terms of cycling facilities at the moment that you collected data, because São Paulo has very strong variation in terms of cycling path, even the schemes for hiring bicycles and so on. During this, let's say, 5 or 6 years, we have seen a very strong variation in the supply and in all the conditions, that even in the support of the government. So I was thinking about what was the data that you used, what was the moment that you were fixing, that you were looking at when you collect the data, and what would be the impacts of the changes that we have seen afterwards, if, of course, you don't have the exact answer because you did not collect the data later, but you probably have an idea of what the impact was.
Yeah, so the study was done in 2017-18. So I think the cycling network would represent the situation, I would say, early 2018. So if there have been major changes in the network, of course, this has an effect on, in this case, on the role of the bike as a feeder mode. Because if you take away part of the network, it immediately, of course, determines how far you can get by bike. And does it allow you to have a bike as a faster feeder mode than walking, or maybe using a bus as a feeder mode? Of course, is also an option. So certainly, the size of the network, the density of the network, the quality of the network is very important when you think about bike train integration, and of course also for bike as a single mode of transport, of course, as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was the last question, and I would like to thank you again for making this presentation, for getting some time in your agenda, in your schedule to come here. And it was very nice to hear. Your presentation was very interesting and challenging. And I think it's offering a lot of challenges for the new students that we hope to have in the near future. So maybe some of the people in the audience will get inspired by your talk and will join us in this PhD program. Well, again, thank you very much. There's another question. Apparently, there's another question. Let's save for the last one. Let's see what is in there. Robert is saying, Helen. Oh, okay. Okay, the last one then. Samuel is back. Samuel Marcus, how the accessibility of the elderly would not be negatively affected by the growing association between mobility and technology, especially in the context of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think this is not only on the elderly, but I think this has to do with the people who are less digitally skilled. And even in countries where there is a high level of, let's say, smartphone use and mobile phone use, such as the Netherlands, still there's like 20-25% of the population who are not well, let's say, digitally skilled. So they might have a smartphone, but they don't know how to use it. Or maybe they have a smartphone, but they would be afraid to book a trip with a taxi, or because it would take also a bank transfer, right? There's not only let's say your skills, but also your trust in the app. And if you have to make a payment, not everybody's willing to do so. So there's actually quite, even in high developed countries like the Netherlands, where 90% of the population has fast internet connections, has a smartphone, you still have people, a substantial part of the population, who are not so much, let's say, digitally skilled. So when you think about the growing reliance on app-based mobility service, it is actually also one of the concerns that I personally have, is that there might be a growing gap between those who are able, who have the digital skills to use app-driven services like a taxi or a bike or even public transport. Whereas what we see in the Netherlands is that also because of the COVID and because of the budget issues of public transport operators, they are likely to cut down their operations. And the people who are typically in public transport are also those who are not so always so digitally skilled. So we think about the elderly or other groups who will now rely on public transport. If they are faced with, let's say, cuts in a network, and they wouldn't need to rely on a taxi or on more app-based services, I think this will certainly affect the travel of those groups. And at the moment, I don't see a quick fix yet, because when I look at most of the app-driven mobility forms, they are often very much, let's say, top-down, or they are developed by some kind of a technology firm, an IT firm, and they're not designed to be a user-centric form of transport. And I think this will be a major challenge to design app-based services which actually allow also people who are not so much skilled in using the service to actually use it. One example could be very simply, if you're an elderly person, you might want your neighbor, for example, to request a trip by taxi for you. But of course, the app should enable to do so. So there might be some very sort of quick solutions for that. But I think this will be certainly a growing problem for our societies, that transport is becoming much more, let's say, IT driven, but the population is not necessarily following in the same pace.
Okay. Before we finish, I would like to mention that Mariana wrote in the chat that the cycling network was indeed that one that was in place in 2018. And she said that the network was already really consolidated, and that you are working on an update. So having said that, I'm just saying it because you're not able to see the chat of YouTube, Karst. So okay. That's just for you to know. Having said that, I would like to ask Adalberto and Flavio if they want to add something, or if you can close this session.
Nelson, I'd like to talk just a little.
Yep.
May I? Thank you very much, Professor Karst, for your presentation. Very, very nice lecture on this topic. On behalf of our 2 graduate programs, I'd like to thank you officially for your presentation. And just updating information on audience, we have a peak of 110 people watching, which is fantastic, I think, comparing to other events, online events that we are watching here in Brazil. So it was a great moment for us. It's very good. And I'd like to invite all the audience for the next one, for the next lecture, which will be at 2 p.m. Today, also on mobility. Okay, so thank you very much for everything.
Thank you, Adalberto.
Okay, Professor Karst, thank you for your nice presentation. It's a pleasure you're present here. And I would like to talk about the next sessions. And I believe that along the day and the next weeks, I hope that we have a very good presentations also. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to join. And yeah, for any audience, if you have a question or interest to, if you feel inspired, let's say by the talk, I hope so, to do maybe a PhD project in a joint PhD degree, do not hesitate to contact me or Nelson or Mariana, and we will be talking to you. And also, if you have still a question, you can just, I guess, pop them to Nelson or to me by email as well.
Okay, excellent. Again, Karst, thank you very much. It was very nice to have you here. And I hope you enjoyed this experience. It's always a challenge to make this kind of presentation because we don't know if the technology will support us in the way that we want. But apparently everything was okay, and it was a very nice presentation, and everything worked just fine in terms of technology and connections and everything. And the participation was really nice, as said by Adalberto. Okay, again, thank you. I hope you have a very nice week, and please stay healthy. And that's it. Thank you very much.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.